Welcome to Roundabout Oxford, a podcast from the University of Mississippi Libraries.
Hi, I'm Joe Moody, audiovisual librarian and assistant professor at the University of Mississippi. In this episode of Roundabout Oxford, I speak with two instructors in the political science department who taught a class last spring that focused on war crimes and acts of terrorism. Although it is not being offered this coming fall semester, there are plans to offer the class again. The class is taught by Dr. Timothy Nordstrom and Chris Ingalls as Political Science 398, International Criminal Justice and Global Terrorism. Chris Ingalls is an international lawyer that focuses on investigations of war crimes and other atrocity crimes in conflict zones.
More specifically, I focus on international criminal law. So I've spent the last 20 years or so working in conflict and post-conflict areas. Most of that work has been in the investigations of war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and terrorism. Those people who work in this field are usually working in spaces where war crimes occur. So I go where those crimes happen. The task is to try and get some justice for the victims of those types of crimes.
Ingalls mentions the importance of evidence.
One of the important things for us is to preserve material. So just like the archives in the library, it's important when we are able to collect material from the battlefield that we document well where it came from. We handle it with care. We know that this particular evidence might not be used in a trial for 20 or 30 years. So we need to make sure that it's stored in a way that it can always be accessible, but at the same time, minimize any damage that might come to it later. And then finally, we analyze that evidence. The reason that we analyze it, obviously, is to support investigations and prosecutions of those people who are responsible for the crimes committed during conflict.
Ingalls gives examples of certain kinds of evidence.
What we learned from having, human remains, skulls potentially with bullet holes in the back or other trauma being obvious, that tells us that people were killed. But then one of the things that we spend a lot of time working with the students on is understanding that might demonstrate that there was a killing. It might demonstrate that there was a murder, but you have to have a lot of other evidence to demonstrate that this murder was committed as part of a genocide or as part of a crime against humanity. And that evidence you won't find at the crime scene necessarily. Right? That evidence is in documents, right, and memoranda from the government, from orders, right, or from insider witnesses, right, that demonstrate what the plans were, right, and how these things were orchestrated, who was in charge of making the decisions to kill all those people. So you have to combine most of the time a lot of different types of evidence that's collected in different ways in order to prove these cases, and that's one of the things that makes them so hard to prove.
The first half of the class focuses on war crimes, while the second half focuses specifically on acts of terrorism. Dr. Timothy Nordstrom is an affiliate professor at the law school and a full professor in the Department of Political Science. He explains that the first week introduces the first war crimes tribunal in Nuremberg.
Because it was the first, it really gave everything that came after it something, right? It wasn't that everything that they did at Nuremberg made it into these other things, because that's certainly not true. In fact, that's one of the more interesting things about the follow-on tribunals, is what they took from Nuremberg and what they didn't take, and how those adapted and changed over time. But definitely, if you're going to talk about war crimes and you're going to talk about the evolution of these institutions that we have chosen to create to try to address the issues, starting with Nuremberg makes perfect sense. And then what you see is sort of the progression through these ad hoc tribunals to the point where you get into the late 90s and people are finally starting to talk about having a permanent criminal court that sits year-round with a full-time set of judges and prosecutors that does war crime stuff. So it makes for a really interesting thing for the students to have conversations about this tribunal had this issue, and then we learned from that and we did this, and then we learned from that and did this. And what you get is a set of legal and political issues that are really, I think, out there for the students to engage with.
I asked Dr. Nordstrom about one of the latest readings as an example of some of the literature connected to the class. The example is a paper from Nicholas Perry titled The Numerous Federal Legal Definitions of Terrorism.
The author claims that there are over 100 different documented definitions of terrorism. And watching the students try to parse those definitions out conceptually was, I think, kind of challenging, but it was also fun to watch because they're thinking. And it gave us a real teachable moment to come in and say, okay, hey, look, this article is telling us something pretty interesting. We sort of adapt this definition to our specific needs. That has led to this proliferation of ideas for what terrorism is. And then it concludes, Perry's article concludes with this call for having just one. Walks through a few pros and cons of having one. What are some things that we might want to think about if we do move to one? And that was something we explicitly asked the students was, do you think that Perry is correct, that we should just have one? And if so, what are the complications of coming up with one?
One draw of the class is the guest speakers. Mr. Chris Ingalls.
We had a former Assistant Secretary General of the UN for Legal Affairs who was instrumental in the drafting of the Yugoslav Tribunal statute. We had one of the former U.S. military and State Department employees who was the key drafter and advisor on the Rome statute for the International Criminal Court, talk about the background to the development of that and why it was that the U.S. participated fully, but then decided not to sign up to the statute. We've also had an Assistant Secretary of State that talked to us about how the State Department engaged on these issues and some of the major actions that he was involved in. And we still have a few left to go. Those will be more focused on terrorism, people involved in investigating terrorism abroad and terrorism in the U.S. And then, in addition to that, individuals who may be U.S. persons but were involved in terrorism overseas. So just as the syllabus is split up into two parts, so are the speakers. Right? The first half of the course had speakers coming in to talk about atrocity crimes, both from the development of those crimes and also from the political side, how we address those issues when we have willingness and opportunity and when we don't. The second half will be on people who have been engaged in both policy development and direct investigations in terrorism cases.
Ingalls explains the significance of having these guest speakers.
These people may have big titles and work all over the world, but they started off in the same place. Right? Started off trying to figure out what they were going to do while they were in their junior and senior year of undergrad. And that's a message I think that comes through from these speakers, right? That it's definitely possible for the folks that are taking this class to end up being the next generation guest speaker, having led some of these organizations. But I think it's also important that as we work to integrate those speakers into the syllabus, they also committed to covering substantive work, right? So it's not just a general purpose sort of career development talk, but each one of them brings with them to the conversation a part of the core materials, right? So, if the prosecutor who was, for example, the chief prosecutor of the Sierra Leone Tribunal, right, comes and tells a little bit about their background and experience, but also is the person that provides the firsthand account on the development and success of the Sierra Leone Tribunal. So these speakers are really part of the curriculum throughout. And I think that was a really big part of what it is we wanted to do, was not have two things running side by side. Right? So not that the two of us teach the class and then we have other people coming in to tell stories, but we worked hard, I think, to integrate them into the teaching itself. And so far, I think that's worked pretty well.
I agree.
Nordstrom and Ingalls explain for whom the class is intended and the goals of the class.
One of the things that I've really learned about from this course, especially from listening to the histories of the people who've been brought in as guests, is that a lot of them started in domestic positions. So the students who might want to do law school, it's not that you have to jump right into an international focus. You can pursue a career in law domestically that gives you the kinds of experiences that would be directly translatable to an international space for the same kind of work. Getting a student abroad, getting a student interested in languages would all help sort of develop those connections of moving from a domestic position to an international position. But this is a great opportunity to come in and see, to get the vocabulary, to get the base knowledge, to get the concepts that are going to be useful to move on.
We see in the media and in policy positions and in statements by government leaders quite regularly terms like genocide and terrorism, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And sometimes they misuse those terms. Sometimes those terms are politically loaded. Sometimes they actually meet the definitions as they have been laid out in law. And I think it's important for anyone who generally has an interest in what's going on in the world to have a basic understanding of those concepts. And not only what is being talked about today, but how they've been applied in the past, right, to provide them some frame of reference. And so I think that's our general goal from this class, is to make sure that we pass on that level of knowledge to students so that they can be more aware of what's going on in the world when these issues are discussed, since they are unfortunately discussed quite regularly.
Roundabout Oxford is created by Brian Corrigan, Michael Carelse, Carmen Sanchez Garcia, Joe Moody, and Alex Watson, with musical contributions from Brian Corrigan and Gail Herrera.